The Skyfall penthouse took your breath by design. Floor-to-ceiling glass that swallowed the city, marble like still water, orchids arranged with surgical precision. It was the sort of place that made people feel smaller and richer at the same time. Luca Voss had learned to move inside those rooms like a shadow, present but unreadable. He had learned to wear quiet armor. It kept his hands steady and his mouth closed. He arrived at midnight, because midnight blurred intention into something harder to interrogate. A concierge buzzed him up to the top floor. He walked in with the measured gait of a man used to being observed, hair trimmed, cheekbones sharp, the fold of his jacket deliberate. The booking said, private, no exchange of information. Double rate, no notes. That last clause, the anonymity, made Luca's chest tilt with the old professional caution and the old professional thrill. Aurora Vale did not strike the world as fragile. Even when she removed the armor of headlines and boardroom polish, she remained the kind of woman who had learned early to be her own weather system. She had money the world could name, a reputation the world could gossip about, and a loneliness no publicist could craft away. That night, she wanted a body in the room that would not ask for her justification. She wanted to be known only by what she said in a private light, not by Forbes blurbs or tabloid whispers. They did not start with sex. They started with silence. Luca waited by the window as rain stitched the city into smudged neon. She entered without fanfare, no dancers' entrances, no dramatic music. Just a woman in a simple silk robe whose presence rearranged the air. She sat across from him, not close enough to be intimate, not distant enough to be indifferent. "This is a strange request," Luca said lightly, breaking the quiet. His voice had the practiced softness that clients paid for, disarming without being cheap. "You're afraid of strange," Aurora replied. Her voice was both a ledger and a caress. She could be counted upon and felt like a gamble at the same time. "I want someone who will sit with me and not file what I say into the world. Be a witness, not a headline." They traded small confessions like currency. She spoke about an old oak tree on her childhood terrace, the one she burned a photograph beneath after a breakup, because it felt ritualistic and private. He told her, vaguely, about modeling gigs that ended when he stopped being pretty enough for covers and how that hollowed him out into something barterable. The conversation pooled into an unusual intimacy, the kind that forms when two people agree to be honest and anonymous. There was no immediate transaction of bodies that night. There was instead a bearing of small truths. Aurora's posture never softened into need, but there were moments when her jokes fell away and her eyes steadied on the skyline like someone measuring the weather of a life she no longer trusted. Luca listened. For the first time in many bookings, he found himself listening not with the trained detachment of the man for hire, but with an attention he could not monetize. When she spoke of the unwanted engagement and the ruthless kindness of her family's expectations, she did not ask for pity. She asked, quietly, if human beings could ever be anything other than their station. Luca said nothing. He had nothing to offer by way of theory. Instead, he did a smaller thing. He offered presence. He offered a smoke on the balcony, a cigarette between two people who allowed themselves to be unspectacular. The city breathed around them. They did not exchange contacts. She told him she would not cross that line. He did not press. They parted at dawn with a handshake that felt suspiciously like a promise. 3 weeks later, when the test slipped inside a paper towel and the word became a kind of tremor in her voice, Aurora walked back into Luca's life without pretense. "I'm pregnant," she said, like someone telling him a secret about her bones. He went still. His training had prepared him for many things. To be impenetrable, to maintain a boundary, to manage intimacy as a service. None of that equipment explained the sudden, complicated lightness that rose inside him when he saw the curved line on the small white stick. It made his hands tremble with a vulnerability he did not own. "You sure?" Luca asked. He asked as if the answer could reassign fate. She nodded. She did not ask him to stay. She did not ask him to decide. She only said, "I'm telling you because you should know." That admission pulled him like magnetism and fear forming a new orbit. He had rules, unspoken ones, and the world had been simple when he obeyed them. You kept the barriers up, you were never named, and you kept your life exchangeable. But between the smell of late-night coffee and the steady press of rain against the penthouse glass, those rules felt like a script he was tiring of reading. Their intimacy accelerated in a way that felt both inevitable and reckless. There were dinners at places that did not admit the sorts of people Luca had become. There were long silences in luxury cars while Aurora drove with two hands on the wheel as if steering herself out of the family orbit. There were nights when Luca sat at the edge of the bed that was not his, listening to the city and feeling like a thief who had accidentally stolen a life he did not intend to keep. When the world's rumor mill finally tripped its first gear, when paparazzi found frames of them slipping out of hotels, mouths forming stories, the heat of exposure pressed cold and ugly. Aurora, smart and battle-ready, withdrew briefly into the public defenses of a woman who understood leverage. Luca watched as headlines were rehearsed, heiress's secret. Scandal. He watched the slow mechanics of how reputation could be bent like metal and reshaped by rumor. When her family's net tightened, the meetings, the cold calls, the merciless pressure, Aurora did what Aurora always did. She negotiated terms the world could read. But negotiation depends on leverage. Luca had none. He had a name that afforded him discretion and a body that bought rooms. He was expendable in a way that hurt something in him deeper than pride. He had thought himself invulnerable because he had always set his own price. He had not accounted for a price his own conscience might demand. On a night edged with rain and the pasted smile of a woman whose life pried her open, Aurora told him there were consequences he could not calculate. She said simply, "This is messy. I can't." Her voice broke like a tide against stone. The act that followed was not melodramatic. Aurora did not drag him into drama or lawsuits. She walked away for reasons practical and sharp. Luca watched the door close and felt, with a clarity that hung in the room, that the private life between them had been a fragile bridge. She left because she needed to survive a world that owned her name more than her body. He was left with a hush and a history that would mark both of them. When she left, the penthouse felt like a relic. When she left, Luca's life contracted back into its old rules. But the introduction of possibility, of someone who saw him and did not buy him, had changed him. He was not the same shadow that re-entered the rainy streets. He had been made visible, even if only briefly. And visibility has a way of creating consequences no amount of money can buy back. By the time the world had whispered itself into a scandal and a different kind of rumor took root, the rumor that would one day call him a name he would not deserve nor deny, Luca had already been rearranged. He had been offered, for a handful of nights, something close to real. That was the danger. That was the gift. And it began, absurdly enough, in a penthouse that could have swallowed the world. If the city had a pulse, it beat faster around Aurora Vale. She carried the weight of an empire along the plains of her cheek, Forbes headlines, press circuits, private jets. She could make a transaction look like art. But even empires have private rooms of grief. Luca had been one such room, a brief privacy in which she had been untethered. The first weeks after they parted were rehearsals for public composure. Aurora marched her life with the precision of someone editing a biography while it was still being written. She returned to boardrooms and algorithms, to product launches that read like prayers to shareholders. She smiled for cameras. She filed damage control statements with the measured cold of someone who recognized the patterns of survival. Yet at night she pressed her palm to the swell beneath her blouse and felt the shape of a life she had not made in corporate spreadsheets. Luca, in contrast, fell into the city's underskin. He kept working, booked clients, watched his reflection in cheaper apartment windows. But he could not unremember. He started to see her everywhere the way grief can appear as weather. In the silhouette of a woman at a bar, in the pattern of a hand gesture, in the echoes of laughter. Aurora occupied a part of his mind he had once promised to keep tidy and transactional. When the tabloids finally lapped at Aurora's heels with the certainty of predators, she did what any heiress might be expected to do. She protected the brand. She arranged a statement. She did the publicist shuffle, denial, deflection, the practiced squint of a woman who could calibrate sympathy on a scale. But there was a fissure in what she said in public and what she felt in private. Publicly, she called it a distraction. Privately, The word she used did not obey public grammar. It was softer. It was fear. Luca watched her on broadcasts, immaculate and furious silent, and felt the world compress into small, furious windows of longing. He told himself, like a patient on a ward, that involvement is business and business is survival. He told himself he should vanish because vanishing had been the template for every wound he had stitched. He told himself he had no right to ask for anything from a woman whose life was a commodity. But the world is classless in the theater of human desire. In the violent privacy of late-night flights, in charity events where she needed no companion, in the way she would sometimes linger at a window looking out at rain, Aurora found herself arranging the same silence she had once bought. She started calling for Luca, not via public channels but through whispers masked by scheduled demands. She asked for the presence of someone who would not be identified in a release. She wanted to talk again, and in asking, she admitted a dependency she had never named. Luca came when she reached out. He told himself he would be the same man, detached, tidy in arrangements. But the man who sat across from Aurora at the private table of a restaurant that tolerated secrets was not the same ghost that had left the penthouse. He had been altered by the knowledge of pregnancy, by the fact that a line of someone's life had come from him. Aurora's presence had grown from a transaction into a complicated geometry he could not measure. They began to cross thresholds Aurora had sworn not to let anyone cross. He attended a gallery opening where she introduced him as a consultant to mollify watchers. He attended a preliminary board event and watched the way she spoke to people, authoritative, untouchable, yet she would steal a glance at him across tables as if confirming that some private weather was still true. Their entanglement created a tension that vibrated against glass and chandeliers. It shined like a dangerous jewel, beautiful and with facets that could cut. At cocktail parties, Luca learned to move as someone not afforded by the ledger of Aurora's life. He learned to tolerate the looks. And Aurora, for reasons she would not admit even to herself, wanted to test the boundary between who she needed and who she could present to the world. When the press finally got the photograph, a leaked frame of them leaving a charity event under umbrellas, the fallout was violent and predictable. Headlines interpreted them as scandal, a billionaire reduced to improper company, an escort elevated into an identification. The stock dipped. Boardroom murmurs became complaints. The public, ravenous for spectacle, demanded clarity. Aurora's advisors recommended a stance that would protect the company, define Luca as a manipulator and absolve the brand. Aurora's chest constricted in a way investors could never account for. She knew on a cellular level what it meant to sacrifice the private for the public good. She also knew the cost of that sacrifice. When cameras rolled and a prepared statement trembled on her scripts, Aurora delivered words the market wanted to hear. She called Luca a con artist. She said she had been misled. The world exhaled, believing a tidy narrative. Luca, watching alone in a small rented room with a kettle and a mattress, felt the humiliation like a physical bruise. He had been erased by a woman he'd once given a measure of himself to. But the story did not end there. There was a fissure left inside Aurora that the stock price could not repair. She had paid the market. She had lied to the public. In the nights after, she could not stop thinking of Luca's hands and the little nod of a smile that came when he felt something true. The act of renouncing him had protected the brand, but it had also left a residue, the knowledge that she had performed a public death for someone real. And Luca, who had been cast as a villain by the script of necessity, did not vanish into drama. He disappeared into work of another kind, work that would reorder him from the inside. He took up manual jobs under false names, learned how to stitch a wall, how to make a door hinge fit. The work was crude and specific, and it taught him the vocabulary of durability. Day by day he shed the persona that the tabloids had appointed him and built, from calloused hands and honest labor, a different self. Their obsession maintained no melodramatic intensity. It slowed into the careful ache of two people who had once intersected like weather fronts and could not quite stop rearranging the air around each other. The world had a way of rewarding appearances while punishing everything beneath them. Aurora Vale's company recovered because crisis managers are magicians and money is a persuader. Her image smoothed back into gloss and schedule. She continued to command headlines, to open subsidiaries, to sign charity checks with the practiced warmth of someone who could buy influence and shape narratives. Yet every move the public saw was argued with an interior counterpoint she could not quiet. The memory of Luca sitting in a penthouse's dim corner, the memory of his hands trembling when he held the test, lived in a private ledger she could not close. Her nights, once predictable, found themselves occupied by a quiet grief that was not public, an ache that made her hollow in ways no market cap could fill. Luca, meanwhile, inhabited neighborhoods that had seen his photograph in tabloid margins and looked at him with a curiosity that was not pity. He found employment with people who cared more about speed of work than pedigree. He fixed scaffolding, he painted apartment stairwells, he learned the exact angle at which to bend metal so it sat true. There was dignity in craftsmanship, not the luxury sheen of high life but a more fundamental honesty. The work changed his hands and, in time, his horizons. A year passed like this. Aurora, gliding through high flights and functions. Luca, trading the world's nighttime offerings for the clarity of a day's tangible outcome. The city that once housed both of them became an atlas of memories, certain buildings marked with ghosts, certain streets lined with the echo of conversations their footprints had held. Then fate, capricious and unglamorous, set them on a collision path neither had scheduled. Aurora, in a fit of unplanned generosity, announced a new initiative, a global design institute intended to uplift women in under-resourced neighborhoods, a gesture she framed as legacy work. The institute's construction site, near the docks, contracted out work that required experienced hands for renovation and oversight. A foreman there recognized Luca, not from tabloids but from previous construction shifts. He hired him for the durability he brought. The first day Luca walked on site, the air smelled like sawdust and possibility. The institute was meant to be a public-facing rebuke to the image the media had once painted of Aurora, an attempt to rechannel scrutiny into something constructive. Luca showed up with a toolbox and a face that no one expected to see connected to the headlines. He had not sought a return to the orbit of the wealthy, he had sought work and a way to fill time with something that measured itself in progress. Aurora visited the site once to measure the mood she'd purchased. She did not expect to see him. But when a maintenance request dragged her to a back wing, the two of them collided in a hallway cluttered with blueprints and paint. She stopped. For a moment there was that odd and private recognition. The world narrowed to shared air. Luca had been reworked by labor into someone who no longer carried the badge of a scandalized man. He had the posture of a craftsman now, deliberate, quiet, honest. "Why here?" she asked, not as a headline and not as an heiress, but as the woman who had once hidden vulnerability beneath formality. "I needed work," he said simply. Nothing theatrical. No hand-wringing. The sentence carried the gravity of someone who had been broken and decided rebuilding was simpler than drama. She watched him for a long moment. There was no press packet, no PR strategy in that hall. Only two people who had been rearranged by an event and were now tasked with living in the aftermath. There is a strange tenderness in watching a person build rather than beg. Luca's hands were steady on a ladder. His voice when he explained a technique was exact. She found, to her surprise, that sight steadied something in her chest. The public had taken from them a private chronology. Reconstructing in silence felt like a way to prove to themselves that they could make truth out of what had been manufactured. They began to speak again, but this time the speech was different. There were no promises of love, no grand apologies. The conversations were about paint choices, about how the Institute's reading room should face the light. They were small acts, humble, necessary, like the stitches that hold skin to bone. One afternoon, while painting a bright classroom wall, Luca told Aurora a simple truth. "You taught me I could be seen without being owned," he said. There was no accusation in his voice, only acknowledgement. It was both an admission and a gift. Aurora cried then, not the staged tears of a headline, but those that come from some far corner of fatigue and recognition. She had believed that power would make her unforgiving, but what power had done instead was make room for empathy she had ignored. Tears were not the end of absolution, they were a start. The Institute opened months later. On the ribbon-cutting day, Aurora stood under the banners and the press, poised and brilliant. Luca was present too, not as a headline but as a volunteer who had earned his place by work rather than notoriety. He watched her make speeches and shake hands. He did not seek the spotlight. Instead, he held himself with the dignity of someone who knew worth could be reclaimed with labor and truth. When the crowd dispersed and the cameras left, Aurora found Luca in the courtyard. For a long while they simply stood in the company of people who had come to build hope. No grand declarations. No pomp. Only the sound of laughter from inside the building, and the impossibility that two lives, once so damaged by each other, had somehow become instruments in a project that might keep hurting people safe. They never returned to the patterns that had undone them. There were no dramatic reconciliations. Instead, there was the subtlety of people learning to repair the frayed parts of themselves. Time, in its gentle cruelty, had done the one thing neither could have planned. It unstitched the hysterical need for a tidy ending and replaced it with something quieter, a life that could accept complexity. Aurora found herself reorienting not around headlines but small measures of good. A scholarship awarded, a workshop scheduled, a child's delighted scream at a new sewing machine. Luca, meanwhile, woke earlier than he had in years to the smell of coffee that was not a nightcap but a morning ritual. There was a rhythm to his days now, the kind of steadiness that comes from waking with purpose. The Institute's second year launched with humility and ambition. The gala to mark the anniversary was a private, tasteful affair attended by donors, alumni, and a few journalists who knew to stay out of the narrative's venomous corners. Aurora spoke about creating a model where women had autonomy over their craft. The applause had weight. It acknowledged the bridge her vision might become. Luca did not attend the gala. He had no desire for spectacle. He had a small habit now of walking along the river after work, watching reflections correct themselves on water. That night, rain threatened and the city wore that gauzy twilight that made things look like memories. He walked under street lamps thinking of none of it, the life that had been, the life that was becoming, until a folded envelope touched his palm at the hands of someone who volunteered at the Institute. Inside the envelope was a note, brief and unassuming, with 2 lines, "For Leo, so he never has to rebuild what I broke. LV." The name struck him like a physical thing. Leo, the child whose laughter he had once imagined from afar, was a name he had never used aloud. He read the note again and then quietly placed the envelope into his wallet. He had never been one to seek recognition for acts of reparation. He had learned that giving, anonymous or otherwise, felt pure. Aurora, on the other side of town, opened the mail that evening and found, among donations and sponsor forms, an envelope with the Institute's logo. Her fingers hesitated before she recognized the handwriting. The initials matched a man she had called stranger and villain and the man who had once listened to her in a penthouse. Her breath caught, not because of headline potential but because someone had remembered a child and stepped forward. She unfolded the note and read the 2 lines. The words did not absolve her, they stitched a new kind of understanding. The note implied that whatever their past had been, someone had chosen to repair without spectacle. Aurora stood in her kitchen and let the implication settle. A quiet act of restitution from a man who had once been humiliated out of love and survival. She thought of the smallness of the paper and the largeness of what it meant. At the opening ceremony for the Voss Initiative, an affiliate of the Institute focused specifically on helping men exit exploitative forms of labor, Aurora spoke carefully. She named the need to create systems that prevented harm and created pathways for dignity. Then she surprised the room. "Sometimes," she said, voice steady, "the people who help us most are those who ask for nothing in return." Luca, who had not sought the limelight, came to the event only because a youth program coordinator insisted he see the fruits of the work he had helped steady. He sat at the back. He watched Aurora address a room that hummed with attention. He did not plan to stand. When she finished, she did something he did not expect. She looked past the podium and found him with her eyes. There was no fanfare. She simply nodded in his direction. It was a brief, public recognition that felt private. No sensational embrace, no theatrical reconciliation. Just a look that acknowledged the mutual debt of dignity. The room did what rooms do. It recognized the moment and returned to applause for the cause. For Luca, applause mattered less than the fact she had looked. After the ceremony, Aurora slipped away to a quiet side garden where he found her waiting. For the first time since their violent, fragmented start, they spoke not as player and client, not as heiress and scandal, but as people who had spent years building small, steady truths. "You never had to do that," Aurora said softly. "The note." "I did," Luca replied. "I wanted him to know there are people who make space instead of taking it." They did not muffle the past with platitudes. They did not propose futures they could not afford. They simply sat in the garden with the night warm and forgiving around them, talking about how to make an institute good enough that rumors would not be its legacy. In the months that followed, there was no cinematic reconciliation. There was instead a series of small, enduring movements. Luca teaching a woodworking class for at-risk youth, Aurora sitting in on a lecture about entrepreneurship and listening, Leo, when old enough, winning a medal at a school art show where Aurora and Luca attended together in different capacities. Their lives braided carefully rather than fused. The story they had started in fire ended in the mundane miracles of people who learned how to repair the harm they had caused. The last image the city kept was not of headlines or scandal but something quieter. Luca, hands weathered and honest, crossing the threshold of a classroom full of kids who shouted his name with unforced delight. Aurora in the back, smiling without cameras. It was not victory over a past lover or a final reclaiming of a broken heart. It was the kind of redemption that does not need an audience. Steady, imperfect, and real. They had learned, finally, that the bravest thing was not to win the other over but to become someone who could be remembered without pain.